Good evening, and welcome to the Finance Committee meeting of October 24th, 2024. At this point in time, we'll call the meeting to order, and I will read the land acknowledgement. The Niagara region and the town of Grimsby are situated on treaty land. This land is steeped in the rich history of the First Nations, such as the Hattah-Wendourong, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. There are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island that live and work in Niagara today. The Regional Municipality of Niagara and the town of Grimsby stand with all Indigenous peoples, past and present, in promoting the wise stewardship of the lands on which we live. Item 3 on our agenda is the point where I ask the committee members if there are any disclosures of pecuniary or non-pecuniary interest. Does anyone have anything to declare? There are no hands up, so we will go with that is a no from everyone. Item 4 is to approve our agenda tonight, and we have had a last-minute addition to our agenda, and it will come up in the agenda, but just to share with everyone that Member Hutchings did resign from our committee early this morning for personal reasons, and so that will be added as a motion at the end of the meeting. So with that amendment to the agenda, could I ask someone to move the adoption of the agenda? Councillor Vardy. A seconder is Councillor Howe. So resolved that the October 24th, 2024 Finance Committee agenda as amended be approved. All those in favor by show of hands, please. And that is carried. Item 5 on our agenda tonight is the receipt of previous minutes. So we will deal with them together unless anyone has any specific questions. So if I could have a mover and seconder to receive the previous minutes of Finance and GDAC. That's Councillor Howe, who has moved. Councillor Vardy has seconded that. Any amendments or adjustments to at least the Finance one, because everyone here was at it? No, then resolved that the Finance Committee minutes of October 3rd, 2024, and the Grimsby Economic Development Advisory Committee minutes of October 3rd, 24th as well be received. All those in favor, please, with a show of hands. And that is carried. Item 6, which is delegations and presentations, we have none before us this evening, and under item 7, consent report, we have no consent reports this evening. So we will now move to item 8, which is our first report, and that particular report deals with the appointment of the auditors for the town of Grimsby. Could I have a mover and a seconder to get it on the floor for discussion? That will be Councillor Kristangi moved and Councillor Vardy seconded that. So at this point in time, I'd like to turn that over to Mr. Delmonico, our Finance Director, to walk us through that.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I'll keep this one brief. Our current contract with our auditors has expired, and we've issued a competitive request for proposals for our annual audit processes, and KPMG is the successful proponent. The purpose of this report is to appoint them for 3 years with an option to extend for a 4th and a 5th year. So this would cover the costs for in the audit period for the 2024 to 2026 year ends, with an option for 2027 and 2028. And happy to say there's no budget impacts as a result of this change.
Are there any questions? Okay, then it has been moved and seconded, so resolve that report, Finance 24-31, the appointment of auditors dated October 24th, 2024 be received, and that KPMG LLP be appointed as the Corporation of the Town of Grimsby's external auditor for the fiscal years ending December 31st, 2024 through to 2026, with an option in favor of the town to extend the term for an additional 2 one-year periods thereafter. All those in favor, by show of hands, please. Thank you. That is carried. The next item on our agenda is item 8.2, which is Finance Report 24-32, having to do with our user fees and charges update. So before we ask staff and our guests to walk us through this, could I have a mover and seconder to get it on the floor, please? Councillor Howe has moved and Councillor Vardy has seconded that. So, Mr. Delmonico, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. We have Daniel Blazevich here from our consultant team of Strategy Corps, and we have Tony Haddad there on the screen too. So I'm going to just turn it over to Daniel now so he can kind of walk us through his report.
Am I good to begin? Okay. Good evening, committee members. I am pleased to join you today. My name is Daniel Blazakovic, and I'm a manager with Strategy Corp. I'm also joined virtually by my colleague Tony Haddad, who is a senior advisor at Strategy Corp. I'm here today to present the key findings and recommendations from the recently completed fees and charges reviews, including a suite of fee recommendations that, if implemented, could generate significant additional annual revenue for the town. And before we jump in, I would like to say thank you to all staff who contributed to this process. It has been a great experience to work alongside the town for the past several months to ensure that the town's various fees align with service delivery costs, comparator municipalities, and the town's overall cost recovery goals. First, it should also be noted that the user fee review assessed 12 different service areas shown here. We will be reviewing key findings for all of these service areas shortly. But before we dive into key findings and improvement opportunities, it's important to highlight the structured methodology we used for this review. We began by evaluating key cost drivers, focusing on direct costs like staff time, indirect costs for support functions like HR and IT, and capital replacement costs for town facilities and other key assets, such as vehicles, machinery, and other equipment used in service delivery. The second key element of our approach was benchmarking against comparable municipalities both within and outside the Niagara region to assess how Grimsby measured up in relation to its municipal peers. Lastly, this review relied on a set of established principles and guidelines that are typically used by municipalities to govern the creation and management of user fees. Primarily, this review utilized the public benefit pyramid methodology, which helps set fees based on who benefits from them. With that said, we can now move ahead to reviewing key findings across all of the service areas. We begin with animal control and library services. Both of these groups have limited fee schedules but do exhibit effective cost recovery. Moving along to finance, this is a group that is highly effective in recovering costs across a range of high volume activities. However, our review pinpointed a number of different services that are currently being carried out at no cost, including, for example, finance staff sending out arrears notices is a good example. Moving along to clerks, clerks does exhibit a balanced and fair cost recovery rate for many of its fee-related activities, which is consistent with the fact that their services, such as carrying out FOI requests and performing marriage solemnizations, generate a relatively high degree of community benefits. Moving along to bylaw enforcement, this group has consistently recovered over 80% of operating costs in recent years, which is impressive. As for fire services, the main takeaway here is that Grimsby Fire Department's hourly incident response rate achieves balanced cost recovery, which is positive, but in some cases, Grimsby Fire is only partially compensated or not compensated at all for incident response, including cases where another fire service or other emergency services arrive on the scene ahead of Grimsby Fire. Moving along to the Grimsby Regional Training Center, our review identified that the GRTC, with its state-of-the-art facilities, faces significant operational and capital expenses. Currently, the center's training tower is only recovering 32% of costs through full-day rentals. The GRTC is also contending with decreasing revenue, largely due to fewer fire departments renting the training tower and decreased enrollment in relevant courses, likely due to competition from new training centers across the Greater Toronto-Hamilton area, some of which have lower rates. Moving along to cemeteries. So over the past several years, cemeteries has achieved a very strong cost recovery level at nearly 90%, and this is primarily due to higher fees versus comparators and additional revenue gained from non-resident fees. As for building services, Grimsby's building services exhibits a strong but fluctuating cost recovery level year over year. Despite this, the service area has maintained a cost recovery rate of over 82% from 2019 to 2023. Building services also has a competitive fee structure, meaning fees are either slightly above or below comparable rates. As for the development application approval process, from 2019 to 2023, the DAP process has achieved a cost recovery level of above 70%, demonstrating an upward trend rising from 61% in 2019 all the way up to 81% in 2023. It should also be noted that the planning legislative landscape has changed dramatically in recent years and even during our own review process. For example, in April of this year, Bill 185 was introduced, bringing several statutory revisions, including the removal of the pre-consultation requirement. As planning legislation has evolved, so has how municipalities are structuring their fees in terms of planning. Among comparable municipalities with similar development patterns to Grimsby, many have recently introduced new DAP fee structures. Particularly, these municipalities charge a base fee across various application types, along with a variable per unit fee that decreases as the number of units increases. This tiered pricing model essentially seeks to more accurately recoup costs based on the scale of a given development. And lastly, we'll look at findings from Public Works and Water Services. In terms of Public Works fee schedule, the main concern identified is that Public Works faces challenges in collecting engineering administration fees due to the fact that fees are currently collected at the time of development agreement registration, leading to potential losses when projects are not subsequently registered or sold. On the water side, administrative water fees are recouping costs at a very high rate, yet for private water services, including water on and off charges, the town is recovering costs at a much lower rate in the range of 30 to 50% for different types of services. With these key findings in mind, we will now move to the final portion of the presentation, and that is reviewing key recommendations. As alluded to earlier, our report identified 37 different recommendations that, if implemented, it is estimated could generate an additional $195,000 in revenue annually. These recommendations are directly linked to the key findings I discussed just now. Thus, I will keep my review of the recommendations at a high level, focusing primarily on significant fee adjustments, fee introductions, or other key considerations. The fee recommendations seen here for finance, clerks, bylaw, and bylaw primarily focus on increasing existing fees and introducing new fees in areas where no charges currently exist, but costs are being incurred. So I mentioned earlier the arrears notices. That's an excellent example for this case. For fire services, it was identified that the town's current non-QEW response rate is slightly below the MTO rate, which governs how much municipal fire services can charge when responding to incidents on the QEW. While this is not an uncommon practice, Lincoln currently has a non-QEW response rate higher than Grimsby, for instance. There is an opportunity for the town to align its rate with the MTO rate to enhance the defensibility of this fee. Also related to fire services, our review identified that administrative capacity issues are leading to delays in invoicing for incident response and inspection services, potentially causing annual revenue loss. As a result, we present a recommendation related to exploring the addition of a new staff resource to provide additional administrative support for incident response and inspection invoicing. For the Grimsby Regional Training Center, our primary recommendation revolves around considering lowering the tower rental rate to potentially better compete with other regional training centers in the GTHA, like Richmond Hill and Oshawa, who offer preferred rates for regional fire department partners with discounts ranging from 15 to 33%. As for cemeteries, our primary recommendation here centers on considering the implementation of a uniform rate for interment services only, as the cost to the town remains the same regardless of whether the individual is a resident or non-resident. Doing so would reflect the equal cost of providing the service while maintaining premium rates for plot and other sales to prevent residents from subsidizing non-residents. Moving along to the development application approval process, the first recommendation revolves around some modest fee increases for various application types, including minor and consent applications, to align more closely with Lincoln. There is also an opportunity for the town to implement a provision within planning's fee schedule in order to recover actual costs associated with the external legal review of different planning applications or the preparation of development agreements. This is common practice across the sector, and the town of Lincoln currently has a similar provision within their schedule. Moving along, and in response to Bill 185, which now allows for privately initiated settlement area boundary expansions outside the Greenbelt, it's recommended that the town introduce a fee to cover staff and potential litigation costs that could occur as a result of this. Similar fees have been adopted by Hamilton and Brantford in recent years as well. And finally, related to my discussion earlier on changing fee structures across municipalities, it is recommended that staff work alongside council to explore the feasibility of adopting new fee structures for the planning department, like those used by comparator municipalities, to better align with Grimsby's unique growth patterns and the increasing complexity of planning applications expected in the coming years. And our final set of key recommendations focuses on public works and water. Similar to the legal fee recovery provision I just mentioned, there is also an opportunity to implement a similar provision in Public Works' schedule to recover the costs associated with special third-party engineering studies, which range in costs but can be quite expensive in some cases. Aside from increasing various permit and water services charges, one other key recommendation focuses on introducing a new fee for sewer lateral investigations in specific cases where a defect is found on the private side of the property line. Currently, the town is carrying this service out free of charge, and implementing this new fee, it is estimated that the town could expect an additional $17,000 in annual revenue. So that concludes the portion of my presentation, and thank you for your time. And Tony and myself are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. At this time, I saw Councillor Vardy's hand go up first, so I will give the floor to you, Councillor Vardy.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I have a question about cemeteries. I've been told that we charge more for burial than surrounding municipalities. I'd like to know if you did comparators to know if that's true or not true, because I don't think we should be charging more, because I've even heard that some people are choosing to be buried elsewhere because our fees are so high. And the other question I have, which you can't answer, I don't know if there's a day of the week that people are buried on more than others. And all I'm thinking of is our rates. You start charging overtime on Saturdays and Sundays. And I'm thinking a lot of time people will bury somebody on a Saturday or Sunday because of people's availability. So if that's the case, maybe we should be changing some of how we're staffing so that those days we're not having to incur those costs. So that's all my questions. I guess the one for you, though, is did we do comparators to other municipalities?
Great question, and yes, we did. So overall, we did find that Grimsby charges higher fees than the comparator average, so the comparator group that we looked at, for approximately 74% of its cemetery services. So overall, you can say that Grimsby is charging at a higher rate than the comparator group average. I'm unable to answer the question on whether knowing which days individuals are most likely buried on, but that is an excellent point to make.
Through you, Madam Chair, do you think we could just make a motion or a resolution to send this question to staff for further investigation? Because we might be losing business, if you want to call it, if people are choosing to be buried elsewhere because of costs. And certainly we want people who live in Grimsby that want to be buried in Grimsby, that they can, that money is not the deciding factor. So I don't know how we want to frame that, or...
I'm going to suggest first that we ask staff to respond to that, and then that may help shed some light on where we go.
Yeah, just I turn that question over to Lisa Martin, our manager of revenues. I'm just wondering if we actually do charge different rates on different days, or do we know if that's the case? Do we charge different rates on different days for burial services?
So let me take a quick look at our findings in the benchmarking report, but my understanding is that there are overtime charges on weekends as well as on holidays as well.
So that would be based on the fact that it costs more for staffing them. That's the rationale.
But if I may, maybe we should change how we staff. Like if nobody's being buried on a Monday, why are we putting most of our staff on a Monday,
I can also add some additional research that we conducted as well to look at internments. So we did look at internments across the entire Niagara region, and we did find, so in the case of Grimsby, Grimsby does differentiate between residents and non-residents for most of its services, including internments, and this is common across the region. So St. Catharines, Fort Erie, Niagara-the-Lake, Welland, and Thorold have a similar approach. Whereas Pelham and West Lincoln only differentiate for plot sales. Interments is the same uniform rate for residents and non-residents. And then Niagara Falls and Port Colborne do not differentiate at all between residents and non-residents across all of its fees. So it is a bit of a mixed bag across the region.
Ms. Martin, did you want to add to that?
I just wanted to add, so we did look at, as Daniel mentioned, there was some benchmarking done, and one of the things that we did to address the high fees was to eliminate the non-resident fees for interment. In discussion, and Tony Haddad was part of discussion as well about cost of available plots and sort of real estate in Grimsby over other areas may be more limited, which justifies slightly higher costs, and we don't want residents who are here and want to be buried here where they live to have to subsidize others that may not, may wish to be buried here. I think the important thing too is to remember that we looked at our costs and what it costs us to do what we do. So although in comparison we may be charging a little higher, the costing was part of the consideration of the fees. It's part of that calculation. So that does take has been taken into consideration further. The other thing I wanted to mention about staffing is that there are agreements in place, so it may not be as easy as just saying we change how we do what we do. There may be agreements and overtime and expectations and understandings with human resources, so it may not be as easy as to us to just reduce those costs. So that would have to be a decision about whether we subsidize those costs and offset in other ways. So I'll just leave that at that.
Any other questions from Councillor Howe? You have the floor.
Pretty clear on all the paperwork that it says draft for discussion. So, it's not, we can take anything back. And in my mind, it's discussion, right? So, to nickel dime, I think what we do is take, the specific ones and refer them back to staff, to ask the staff to report back on the ones that, are specific to them. I don't want Public Works, whatever, but, so that's my feeling. We can't piecemeal it. Let's all go back, and because it's been over 10 years since the user fees were reviewed. A lot has changed. We talk about our cemetery. Be interesting because I'm going to guess that we probably have one of the newest, that the Mountain Cemetery is probably one of the newest cemeteries in the whole region. And we did that in the 90s. So the cost would have been a whole bunch more than down at Queens Lawn, where it's, 150 years old or something like that, and the costs are minimal, if that. So I think that you need a little bit more of a wholesome look at it, and let's understand it. It's easy to pick out, oh, there's one number, and I don't like that number, but I think we get it back to the people who know what the heck they're doing, and let's ask them for their thoughts and where they stand. Now, that said, and I said to Daniel, that report that they came up with and back to us is as clear and as concise and as illuminating as just about any report I've ever seen come back to us. They talk about the comparators. How often do they talk, well, so-and-so or such and such down the road from us, they don't charge that. But you refer to the comparators. Very clear. And it's in my mind, and I think we can easily do it, but it certainly gives us something excellent to start with. And the next part, or the one last part is, and as Daniel and myself talked about, he kind of dodged the bullet in as much as Recon Parks isn't on here. Recon Parks is not on here because we're doing the old, its own plan. That's where you're going to get into, the real name calling and whatnot. Because little Johnny needs to be able to play his hockey for $1.98 or something like that. But let's get back to staff. Let's ask them for a report back. The world's not going to change in 4 weeks or 5 weeks or something like that. So it can be worked into a workload. And it's pretty clear. That's my feeling. Let's get it back to staff.
I think Member Thompson had his hand up next.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, Chair. So now's not the time to ask. We're going to maybe look at what Councillor Howe had said and provide all our input through to you, and then have staff respond, because I do have several questions.
Go ahead and ask your questions.
Okay, they're probably for the director. One of them is Schedule P. Is our water and wastewater rates not going to be publicized, fixed rates and variable rates? Do they not get publicized? Or did I miss it?
Yeah, so through the chair, the consumption rates weren't part of the study. So the two areas that really were out of scope were the community service program fees and rental fees, as well as water, wastewater consumption rates. That's going to be just come forward as part of the budget.
Okay, thank you. The only reason I asked that is our last report, just on October 3rd, it's clearly stated user fees and charges revenues. That's the only reason I asked about it, and seeing it not in there was one of my questions. Another question I have is, I think Fire answered a lot, and the chief will be able to answer you. And he answered his own question about possibly another staff member, but there's a little side note in there called Fire Marquee. It's a third-party company. That it's basically a collection agency. Lincoln uses it. We did look at it in the past, but I think it's something you can definitely look at, and possibility. Then again, the sphere of council has sending a collection agency out there sometimes can come back to you. And the question I also have for the director was, have you heard of an insurance premium tax through insurance companies and municipalities going after that?
Through the chair, no, I don't believe I'm aware of what that's referring to.
The reason I asked that is just through my studies, that because of Fire Marquee and everything that was going on in the day, the insurance companies already pay the province a premium that homeowners really don't see, and they collect it. It's a lot of money. And from what I understand, municipalities may be able to go after some of that money, and it could be significant. And it's an insurance premium tax, they call it. And it may be something we can look into if we decide of another revenue source, possibly.
If I could just clarify, so I assume we're talking about when there's an accident and the fire department is called out and then levies a fee for attendance at the site, et cetera, et cetera. You're saying there's another opportunity to recover from perhaps the province. Am I understanding that correctly?
And through you, Jerry, it's close. So when the fire department goes out and they do send an invoice, and it's through their fees and charges, there's an opportunity, instead of going through Fire Marquee, possibly because you're already paying this through your insurance premiums and the province is collecting it, you can go back after this tax. I'm sorry, I'm not the expert in finance. It's just something I had read about back in the day, and it's a premium. And if you read about the insurance industry, very disappointed in these collections agencies because taxpayers are already paying their taxes to the town for a fire service, and they're also paying, they didn't know that this premium tax is coming out of their fees to the province, and the province keeps it. Something I was very shocked at, and that's one reason I never went after Fire Marquee at the day. But I think the fire department's come up with some great ideas there. And just one last quick thing was, page 123 of the report, Schedule F, you may want to look at the inspection service for licensing under the clerks for the fire department going out to these oh my God, chip wagons and all that come to town. Fire departments do inspect it. Your fee's actually right now lower than what the new fees you're looking at bringing it up to. Thank you.
I think Member Scandinavo had his hand up next.
Thank you. Just to clarify for everyone, when you say recovery, you're referring to the rate at which these user fees recover against the total program cost, or the ability to collect the user fees?
The total costs, including direct costs, so staff time, processing effort, indirect costs, so those overhead support functions, HR and IT, for example, as well as capital costs associated with it. So total costs associated with delivering the service.
So to continue with that, when you say we collect approximately, I think you quoted 82% against bylaw, we're saying that the fines levied represent about 82 to 83% of the total cost of bylaw.
Can you, sorry?
So earlier, you quoted
Yep.
approximately 82 or 83% recoveries on bylaw. You're saying that the fines levied against offenses represent about 82 or 83% of the total cost to operate the bylaw department.
No, I'm saying that bylaw, the total cost of delivering those fee-related services on the schedule for bylaw is recovering 82% of those costs.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
My apologies.
No, all good. So there's a lot of comparators in there in terms of like what our user fees are against, neighboring municipalities. And, I'm curious, were the property tax rates also compared? Meaning that one municipality might charge much more for services, but their property tax rate might be lower. So I think we're only looking at half the coin here, right? If someone charges a higher property tax rate but a lower user fee versus a municipality that charges the opposite. I'm going to get confused as to which order I went on that. But was there a comparison there done, or was this strictly user fees?
This was strictly a user fee study, yes.
Okay. I think that's, again, I think Councillor Howe recommended this is taken back, but like I noticed Hamilton has some pretty high user fees, but I suspect if you were to punch in your assessed value from impact into a Hamilton property tax calculator, it might yield a lower property tax rate. So we're only comparing half the coin. I think that's just my opinion, but thanks.
I think Tony Haddad from my team wants to jump in.
If I could assist on that, Councillor, comparing user fees is specifically focused on the service provided to the customer for those fees by the respective department. When we start looking at tax rates, of course, it is looking at the total budget expended by the municipality and the various departments through the various programs and services that are delivered. And of course, based on the municipality's total assessment, the tax rate is calculated. So I don't think you can make a fair comparison of tax rates to user fees, because the user fees are specific to a particular service where the tax rate is encompassing all programs and services delivered by the municipality. Hopefully that's helpful.
I understand exactly what you're saying, Tony. I slightly disagree, because if user fees are not 100% recovered, in my opinion, it means the delta is then recovered from property taxes in order to operate the program, again, unless I'm mistaken. So although I do understand there's two ways to approach this, or they're based on two different models or two different systems of calculation, I think they should be looked at holistically as, they are ultimately all coming from the residents of Grimsby for use of town services or town facilities or, town offerings. But nevertheless, just an observation on my end.
I'm going to just make one comment, and then certainly you can have the floor, Ms. Martin. It's an interesting observation, and one that I know everybody probably is curious about as to how our tax rates compare to our neighboring municipalities around us. And so my question to staff is, would you be able to put a report together for us that just literally compares tax rates of our surrounding municipalities or comparators, I'll say geographically and perhaps by size of maybe 10 or 12 of them? It's probably not that hard to do. You can go to their websites and get their tax rates and so on. That may actually shed a bit of light to not supply the answer necessarily, but at least tell us where we stand in relationship to our neighbors. Comment, and then Ms. Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure we could. I mean, I don't want to overpromise, given that we're in high budget season right now. But I think a key thing to note on your comment there about the fairness of the user fee, I mean, it does go back to the benefit pyramid that Daniel talked about, right? It was looked at in terms of, should we be recovering 100% of the fees, or does it make sense to recover 75, 50% of the fees, depending on how much benefit actually accrues to the end user? The more that accrues to the user, the more they should be paying 100%. Whereas in some cases, it makes sense that they're not paying 100%, and the rest falls onto the tax levy.
Ms. Martin, go ahead.
I was just going to comment first that some of that information might be available through the region already. There may be, I'm not sure, I haven't looked recently, but on the website they do have tax calculators and comparisons too, but we can take that back. Tony stole my thunder a little bit about the user fee, how they're calculated, and there is a relationship to the tax levy in that when we're looking at user fees, we're looking at services that are exclusive to a certain group of customers or certain persons that want a service over the entire population of the municipality. So it's important for us to look at what the costs are, how much is that person entitled to pay for? Is there any public benefit to what's happening? And then to be sure that that doesn't negatively impact the tax levy, so we're not over levying because we're subsidizing something that we shouldn't be. So I think in looking at these schedules as we put them together and considering indexing and, growth as we anticipate it to be maybe, not as robust as we would like it to be, it's important to consider that as we're looking at these schedules too, that it will impact our levy if we are overly conservative or we're not accurately reflecting the cost of what's happening.
Yeah, my comment wasn't to not necessarily accept these rate changes. It's just more or less to say, I think, and again, somebody jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, I just think we're looking at like half the coin, right? Because I think I think they're both related, right? Like there's a levy for your taxes and then there's these service fees. And I completely agree. Some things should be 100% recovered and others not. But I just think when we're doing a comparison here, we should compare the other half of the coin, which I believe are the property tax rates, just so everyone has an ability to make a fair decision. That's all. Again, not that I'm, disputing your research here and your comparators, just rather, I think, one more piece of information would be helpful to allow council to fully understand what they're agreeing to.
Any other questions from the committee members? Then I will take the opportunity to ask a few questions, if you don't mind. So we are talking about, the recoverability rate of many of these. Have you ever run into any municipalities who actually recover 100% of their costs through some of their fees?
I'll allow Tony to jump in here. Tony's was a longtime CAO, so he could probably provide some perspectives. But through our research and the work we've done, I think it is typically quite rare to recover 100% across most service areas. In our report, and we do have recommendations within it that there are opportunities to increase to 100% cost recovery, especially for those types of fees that accrue, all the benefits accrue specifically to an individual. So sending out arrears notices, bill reprints, setting up tax accounts, and so on, there are opportunities to bring that up to 100%. So perhaps those fee-related services that are typically more administrative in nature, there always is an opportunity to get up to 100% in cost recovery. But across other service areas, clerks, for example, or bylaw enforcement and others, fire is obviously a great example. It is very rare to get to that level, but I'll let Tony speak on it as well.
Thanks, Daniel. And to your question, Madam Chair, the experience across a variety of municipalities will widely vary. Many of the fees that are applied are capable and often do recover 100% of the cost associated with the provision of that service. But there are many others that do not, and oftentimes for a variety of reasons, based on council policies, practices, council's appetite for the application of fees directly to the user, as opposed to relying on the tax base to provide a certain level of subsidy, as has been mentioned, on some of the programs and services being provided. So at the end of the day, the benefit of one of the recommendations that are before you in this report is to allow council to consider what tolerance you have for rate recovery. If you desire to recover 100%, there's opportunities to do so, perhaps all at one time in the current year, or to phase it in to allow for a timely adjustment for those fees to be to reach 100% over a 2, 3, 5-year period, depending on how much of the fee is currently below the 100% threshold. But again, oftentimes it depends on the desire and the tolerance and the expectations of council in certain fees being 100% recovery, while some may be desirable to have a partial subsidy by the tax base. So while it can be achieved, it becomes a local decision, and they vary across the province's 444 municipalities, particularly the mid to large size municipalities.
So related to that then, because this finance committee's role is really to advise council on policies and I'll say forecasting and, things at a higher level, I will say. So if there were some areas that you thought our fees could eventually reach 100% recovery, would you be able to provide us with a list so that we could at least take that into consideration and look at and consider whether that is something that we should be recommending to the full council, that, we don't just accept inflationary increases, but that in certain areas we should, I'll say, more actively increase the fees? Would it be possible for you to give us a list like that?
Yes, so we have provided that information already to Lisa, Antonia, and your team. So all of the different cost recovery levels that we looked at for various fee-related services, we created a table where they were recovering below a 75% threshold, what that fee would need to be set at in order to achieve 75% cost recovery 85% cost recovery, and 100% cost recovery. As I mentioned, sometimes there's more of an appetite to phase it in over years. So we did provide 3 different thresholds for that for all of the different cost recovery rates we looked at. And Lisa and her team have that information.
It's not in the report, though, right? So you're saying our staff have that?
Yes.
Would it be possible to share that?
I would say that, yeah, this is basically what's been recommended in Schedule Q as the recommended changes, right? Those are the ones that are increasing beyond the inflationary increases. In cases where we aren't increasing to the full 100%, they've been noted in the comments section.
And so would there be somewhere we're considering a phase-in up to 100% over a few years? Would there be an appendix on that?
So one of the examples was the death registration. So our fee, I'm not recalling exactly what it was, but it was going to a higher level over several years. So not significantly increasing. So I think it was from $13 possibly up to eventually up to 27. So not bringing that immediately in, so phasing that in. I was just going to mention too on that Schedule Q. So we did implement most recommendations. There were some cases where we took a look in cases such as the NSF charge, and we know we felt it maybe was too high to go to that 100% cost recovery level. So we've mitigated that slightly just because we've paired those fees with our water fees as well for finance. And we know that we have an increase of transfers to tax roll, and there's a bit of a work happening to help our water customers manage higher bills and the change in the methodology. So there was a lot of consideration that went into those levels as well. But if you have any questions, we can bring that back, and we can probably share those full findings as well through later.
Would the committee find that useful to have those findings? I see heads nodding up and down. I will take that as a yes. I do have a few other questions here, and perhaps this question is to Daniel. So throughout your report that you had on the screen tonight, you have estimated dollars for increased revenue on the one column there. And so in my mind, A times B equals C. So I assume, if A goes up and that's the fee, B had to be the number of units or activity in that particular area to equal C, which then is the total revenue that you're expecting could be increased, right? So my question has to do with the B. A times B equals C, B being the number of units. So in all of those activities where you have estimated the revenue, how do you know the units of activity? How did you arrive at that? And sorry, this is a really specific mathematical question.
No, it's a great question, and it's true. It is very mathematical. But what we did is, so for a lot of the fee-related services that are carried out by the town, there is a record somewhere of them. So death registrations, for example, staff were easily able to go in and see the year-over-year number of those services carried out. In other instances, we relied on estimates from staff where that precise information wasn't available. So we did use those estimates as proxies. So we were able to use whether we had the actual data that was recorded or the estimates provided by staff to use for those calculations for estimated revenue increases.
Thank you. And now my next set of questions has more to do with the competitors of our town that you were looking at in your study. And when we were comparing to I'll call them our competitor municipalities. Sounds strange, I guess sometimes we are, right? When it comes to, being buried in our town or another town or whatever, I guess that is a competitive pricing situation. But do we know when these other municipalities last did a review of their fees and charges? Because if they did it like 10 years ago and we're comparing to their old fee structures, then perhaps they're not really current, right? Anyway, so my question is, yes, do you know when those competitors last had their studies done?
Yep, so it wouldn't necessarily be a user fee study, but each year, my understanding is municipalities will publish their user fee schedules. So that is an obligation for municipalities to complete year over year. So during our benchmarking exercise with all the comparator municipalities, we did look at the most recently publicly available user fee schedules, which were typically all within the last year.
But is that when they had their last study done? I guess that was my question, like.
You
we
wouldn't
know
be
that.
able to know when they last completed their study unless there was public information available. We were just looking at the most recent user fee schedules that they published.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, that is public information. That's all we can do, unless they were a client of your office or something and you knew when they had last done a study. Okay. And now my last question really has to do with where we go with the recommendations and the implementation, because many of these recommendations that come out of the report, one of those last pages that you had that was summarizing it by building and clerks and all our various departments, with recommended increases in recommended work, even if it was something like fire, looking at fees and so on. So I guess this really is a question to our staff as opposed to our guests tonight, but where do we go now? How do you see this being studied further? Do we see it being done by each of the individual departments and then through finance coming back with what action they're proposing to take? Or talk to me about, how we action this going forward.
So yeah, the attached schedules are the recommended fees that are to be approved. I would say if there's any particular fees that you want to have re-reviewed, that you let us take that back for comment for the next meeting. But I think we would want some clear directions so we can have the fees updated for January 1st.
Oh, sorry. I was talking more about one of the last slides in Daniel's presentation where we were talking about the various areas, and you just had them highlighted, a few by each department, where they warranted further consideration, right? That it's that particular schedule, so not the actual overall fees and charges, but the ones that I think warranted some additional looking at. Sorry, are we able to bring that back up or find it?
It's actually the last page of Schedule Q of the report.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Recommendations for future considerations. So, yeah, that's something that we'll take back and talk over with staff. And then if there's anything that has to come out of that in terms of a further review or cost, we would bring that forward as part of the budget or a separate report.
That's my question to the committee members. I realize, but how will we know then what action has been taken? Because when we get into the budget, our lay members don't usually participate in as much detail in the budget discussions. And any action taken on some of these, of course, will be, buried is not the word I'm looking for, but you know what I mean? Like it's part of the minutia of how we come up with the revenue numbers in the budget. So probably not something that would leap out at any of us as councillors thinking, oh yes, that's the one where they were going to look into and now I can see that number has changed. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just kind of lost in the great detail of our budget. So is there any way to even summarize actions taken on some of these items to come back to the committee so we know, the department looked at this in more detail, they agree we should do this, and here's the recommendation or something?
So yeah, I would say if there was any action taken, you would obviously see that come through the user fee updates. It would have to come through to committee or council as a recommendation. What you might not see is something like, if there's a recommendation to add an FTE for fire and that's decided that that's not needed, well, then it's kind of how do I put it, like a non-action. There's no approval needed, you know what I mean? So that might not necessarily come back to committee that way.
Ms. Martin, go ahead, you have the floor.
I was just going to add that all of the additional recommendations for future consideration, those are things that we are considering and discussing with staff. We've had some discussion with planning and our public works teams about the recommendation to look at maybe a further in-depth study related to those changes, as well as fire, talking with them about their revenue collection practices and the additional FTE and whether we've made contact about Fire Marquee and looked into those options as well. So there are things happening. I was just going to recommend maybe a memo at some point too. We could just bring back to update in, 6 months or so, maybe.
As to what actions have been taken by the various departments on the action items. I would just hate to see that they fall in the cracks and that we're not aware. And I look at it as there are recommendations that have come to this committee, that there be some further investigation in certain areas, and we would just like to follow up and make sure that that really is done, right? Maybe that's a good suggestion, that in after the budget is done or something, I'm going to say like springtime or something like that, that you just put it on the to-do list, I guess, and come back with, okay, here's where the items were that we were going to be looking into by the department. The budget's now done. We've looked at these. Here's an update on the actions that we're suggesting or on the research that was done. Does that make sense to the committee members? And that's why I'm asking, because I can see some wrinkles on foreheads there, like. No, I think the time to make comments is this evening on anything specific. So if you have some, I will say probably a department or some specific questions that you feel you still have questions on, now's the time to ask, for sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, then. As you know, coming from the town, working here for a long time, I do have the operational experience. I strongly suggest that finance look at software. It's going to cost money, but software can solve a lot of FTE problems. I've experienced it myself, what I see is going on in here, but software can sure solve hiring FTEs, and if Treasury looked at it. There's an opportunity to do that, and I hope you strongly look at it. It might cost a lot of money, but at the end of the day, I know how other municipalities work, and you can alleviate an FTE by looking at software. Thank you.
Any other questions from committee members? Member Scandinavo, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Chair, I'm just a little confused. So we have these recommended fees. Tonight, we've made our comments on them. When you say take them back to the department, does the town department have a say in changing these fees, or are we just accepting, or is this document just going to be sent to council for acceptance in its entirety? Sorry, that's where I'm lost.
I hear you. I think I was talking more about some of the recommendations on additional items to look into in the future. And so the schedule is the schedule that has come to us tonight, right? But there are some recommendations that have come forward to us saying you need to investigate or look into some of these other matters. And I'll say anything from, fees that we're charging for accidents that the fire department is sent out to, or whatever the example was. It's those that I'm thinking would go back, so that we're taking to heart the recommendations from our consultant, that there are some areas that warrant a wee bit more investigation, and those are the ones that we're asking be looked at, and then a report come back to us in 6 months or something like that. But that this schedule itself, unless you have any specific items on it that you want to send back, once we complete it, our review and our questions, that we will be basically, accepting it and forwarding it to council for their endorsement. But Ms. Martin, correct me if I said that wrong.
No, that's right. I was just going to also mention in the development of the fee schedules that we put together, the actual schedules for each division, the departments were heavily involved, and we had many conversations. So there's a lot of discussion, and they had a lot of input into that, as well as consideration of sort of overlapping and ongoing projects. For example, planning has the master plan ongoing. Fire, as we know, is going through the Fire Master Services Plan. So a lot of the things that are for future consideration, we have to consider in light of some of the things that are happening at the same time too. So I just wanted to mention that.
So the clerk was just sharing with me that as we were talking about these additional recommendations warranting further study in some areas, that she has put together the wording of a resolution to basically go in addition to the standard one that tonight we would be approving the drafts and forwarding it to council and so on. Are there any, so in addition to that, are there any specific departments or areas, though, that committee members have concerns about where their questions have not been answered, or they would like to send it back to staff and our consultant for further consideration? Councillor Kristanji.
Thank you, through Chair. I just have a little bit of concern of charging for heritage permits, just because of all the designations and the added costs and stuff like that. I just have a little bit of concern on that one. I would like to hear from heritage staff if.
I think, and I'll ask our staff to speak to that, but they did say they have spoken to every single department and they've all had input into it. But Ms. Martin, go ahead.
Yes, so that is something as part of a future recommendation, and we also know that they're looking at heritage as far as potential grants and things, so we haven't made any decisions on that. And it is mentioned as one of the recommendations, but nothing that we've enacted yet.
And did I see any questions down on this side? Councillor Howe.
Just through you, Chair, we've got, Director, the water, we've got an opportunity to try to understand, possibly, if it's possible, to the water and of our fee structures and how we're capturing it. And because there's a whole lot of different ways of accountants looking at our water structure and our water bill, and everybody looks at it differently. I guess I'm just concerned that, you know, we've got a place here that we're talking about fees, and can we provide more clarity, I guess, on our water and on our wastewater and how it works out. Ms. Martin, I know that there's a fair amount of phone conversations on a pretty well an ongoing basis as we all try to wrestle with it and understand it. I guess that's one big area that I do have a concern. I think we could learn more from people who know what they're talking about to come back to us. And it doesn't have to, we're not going to change the world in a month or anything. And I understand about the budget going forward, and there's a whole lot of high-level things going on. But we've got an opportunity. I just don't want to say goodbye to it, you know, without knowing that maybe we can learn something going down the road.
I think, so the water and wastewater, of course, is not part of this
Correct.
schedule. So we're diverging and getting on a second topic a little bit here. Are you thinking that maybe as we're going through the budget that a separate report could perhaps come from our finance staff about that, about that issue again, about what our rates are and so on?
Somewhere along the line, it's got to come forward to us.
I will ask Mr. Delmonico to comment.
Yeah, no, that's duly noted. Yeah, we can make a note of that for the budget process and presentation and kind of explaining that a bit more.
Okay, if there are no other questions about our presentation and our fee schedule tonight, then I will read the first two parts of the motion, and then I will get the next part from our clerk here. So resolve that Finance Report 24-32, 2025 User Fees and Charges Update, which is dated today, October 24th, 2024, be received, and one, that the recommended 2025 draft user fees and charges be approved as outlined in Appendix B through P, and two, that staff be directed to prepare the necessary bylaw and schedules to update the user fees effective January 1, 2025. And then the third part, I will let you read.
It would just be to include them that staff bring a memo back to the Finance Committee in Q2 2025, highlighting any action taken on the additional recommendations raised by members.
Let me just run that by staff. Q2, is that timing good? That's about 5-6 months from now, realistically. Q2 is anywhere from April to June. Okay. So those are the three parts of the motion tonight. Then, do I need someone to amend the moving and seconding of it now that it's been adjusted? Okay. Then by a show of hands, please, all those in favor of those three parts of the motion. And any opposed? We have one opposed. Thank you, but that motion is still carried then. Thank you very much for your presentation tonight to both Mr. Haddad and Mr. Blazakovic. Did I pronounce it right? Thank you very much for coming this evening and for all of your work on this.
Very welcome.
We will then move on to item 8.3 on our agenda, which has to do with Report Finance 24-33, and it has to do with our reserves and our reserve fund policy. I will turn the floor over to Mr. Delmonico.
Thank you. Yes, this is a policy that's due for renewal. And so just for some background, right, reserves are financial management tools that help support long-term objectives. So having appropriate and adequately funded reserves, it's a primary way to fulfill our financial obligations while maintaining predictable, steady levels of expenditures. And so our policy outlines 4 different types of reserves. The first is a contingency and stabilization reserve. So that type of reserve is established to help deal with emergency, unplanned, or one-time expenses. And by having such reserves, can fund types of expenses and avoid having them result in large operating budget swings from year to year. So for these types of reserves, we've established target balances, and those have been identified in Appendix B of the report. The other type of reserve is the asset management reserves. So those are for renewal and rehabilitation, of our assets. And having adequately funded asset management reserves allows for timely maintenance to take place, because those are relied on as regular, recurring sources of funding for subsets of specific assets depending on the type of reserve. So in those cases, we feel it'd be appropriate to identify a target annual contribution level as opposed to a specific balance that the reserve should maintain on a regular basis. Now, we recently completed our asset management plan, and through that process, we identified a funding gap, an annual funding gap of $4.9 million over the next 10 years. And, when we step back even further and look at things from a life cycle perspective, that gap may be more like 11 million. So, when you look at that and you look at what our contributions to reserves are now, which is $6 million a year, and we receive an external funding of about $2.8 million per year on top of that, you can see that, we need to increase those contributions to reserves so that they can be sustainable long term. So as a next step, what we'd like to do is link those assets, our assets, with each reserve that supports them to arrive at an annual contribution level that would be appropriate. So that's something that we can kind of begin to work toward. I just warn that, the amounts being contributed are going to be substantially different than the amounts required. But again, something we can begin to work toward. The third type of reserve that we have are what are called special purpose reserves. Those basically could be established for varying purposes, and because the purpose could vary, the target balance would likewise vary. And then the last and fourth type of reserve we have is a reserve fund. So what we mean by reserve fund those are the ones that are established to account for funds that have been segregated for a specific purpose as required by statute. So you'll see that the updated reserve policy is attached as Appendix A. The changes that have been made to the policy are highlighted in red. And then Appendix B is a listing of our current reserves and reserve funds along with their purpose, their funding sources, their target balances or contributions as appropriate, And as mentioned, for target balances, we'd like to identify that on a reserve-by-reserve basis as a next step.
Any questions? This is a really important one. Perhaps I could just ask for some clarification before I take questions from the committee members. The asset management plan with the, I'll call it the gap of 4.9 million. Remind me again, is that an annual gap? Was that an annual gap, right?
That is correct. That's an annual gap.
So let's open up the floor. And I guess before we do that, I was remiss. Did I ask for someone to move and second that? I don't think I did either. So we jumped right into the report, and I was remiss. If I could have someone move and second that. Councillor Vardy is moving that. Councillor Cristangi is seconding that. So we have it officially on the floor. Now I will open it up to questions. Any questions about this particular policy? Member Scandinavo.
I agree, Chair. This is a very important report. We've spoken at great lengths about ensuring we understand, we often receive, I shouldn't say often, but from time to time we receive requests to approve funding from a reserve fund. And it's hard to approve it on an ad hoc basis if you're not totally sure of what else needs to come out of that fund. So in my opinion, if I've understood this correctly, this is simply we haven't necessarily analyzed the funding requirement yet in detail. This is simply trying to categorize what would sort of formally categorize what would fall in each bucket, right? And then additionally, I think I just want to tie this back to last meeting where we looked at the financial statements and there was a significant amount in reserves already. I think it was like 8.7 million overall that was being transferred into reserves. I don't quote me on that number, but it was a significant number. So are we insinuating, again, you've done some rough math, but contributing approximately another 5 million to reserves in addition to that? Is that what I'm understanding? So those are my sort of two questions.
I will let Mr. Delmonico have the floor.
Yeah, your understanding is correct. Based on the work of the consultant through the asset management plan, they're saying that 4.9 or 5 million is needed on an annual basis to sustain the requirements over the next 10 years. Because many of our assets have lifespans beyond 10 years, when we look at it from a life cycle perspective, that's where that 11 million comes in. If we were to fund some of those, all assets over the course of their useful lives, we would probably need about another 11 million a year. We'd have to get to that point to actually have them be able to be sustainable long-term, funded from reserves. So that's why you'll see a lot of municipalities have capital levies being implemented where they start to grow those bases over, like Niagara's plan is over a 50-year period. These aren't short timeframes that we're dealing with. So. And really what you're trying to get to there is where when an asset needs to be replaced, you have the funding in the reserve to replace it. You're not relying on debt or external sources, which may not always be available.
If I could just add, I guess, and I use this example to try and help me understand. So, we're talking about the contingency reserve, that's separate, but then we're talking about the asset management or the asset type reserves where we think a certain amount should go in. And I would just like to share with my fellow committee members and anybody who's listening, an example that was something that I saw in my life. There were two families basically, and they both wanted to make improvements to their houses over time. The one family, year one, decided whatever the project was, we want to do it now, so we will go and borrow the money, do the project immediately at the beginning of the year, and then would spend the next 2 years repaying those borrowings back. And then in year 3, they would borrow again for the second project, and they work their way up to year 10, at which point in time they've done 5 projects, but they have incurred interest every single year in those 10 years. The second family says, we want to do the same 5 projects, but in year 1 and 2, we're going to save our money. And then at the end of year 2, we're going to take on that project. then, so they're paying for it with cash, basically, or with savings, no interest expense. Then at the beginning of year 3, takes on the second project, at, year 3 and 4 saves for it, at the end of year 4, does the second project, and makes their way through that 10-year period, does 5 projects again. Their house looks the same as the other family. The difference being they didn't have immediate gratification because the second family has spent the first years saving, then they do the project, then they save, do the project. So they have not incurred interest expense. And I use that example because that's how I see a municipality using our reserves, is that we save, so we basically levy it, then we take those monies, we save them in reserves, and then after a number of years, we actually undertake that project. And then we save, and then, now, this is much more complicated in a municipality than my example I gave of the 2 households. But the thinking is that we use our reserves to save, and then we spend them. And in that way, we always have the money should anything sort of come up earlier. We minimize our interest expense because, we're not going out and borrowing to do these projects and then spending the next years after that collecting from our taxpayers in order to do it. So it is a much more thoughtful and nuanced approach, and really minimizes our interest expense in all of that. And so I guess that's what we're trying to move to as an organization, that more and more, we will levy, we will save more into the reserves so that as each project comes up, we have the money to actually undertake it. And that this is for just the regular replacement of what I will call our everyday assets. Roads, water, sewers, that sort of thing. But I think the thinking then was that there would also be additional thinking behind what I'll call one-offs or, new projects or whatever. Can you just speak to that and how you were thinking of those?
Yeah, we actually touch on it in the next report, the capital financing policy. But yeah, it's basically new projects. The idea would be that growth would pay for growth. We would use things like development charges, community benefit charges. We would use the reserves to pay for replacement and rehab of existing assets. And then you would have debt could be utilized in cases where you want to take on a strategic project, like the West Lincoln Hospital, for example, or a significant a new project like the Peach King Center. And then by minimizing your use of debt, you would then have flexibility in case, again, emergencies come up. And then you have debt room that you can call on. You're minimizing your financing costs because you're not paying for debt. You're being able to pay for it using cash, like you had suggested in that example.
Councillor Vardy.
Okay, so if I'm, through you, Madam Chair, if I'm getting this right, I'm really frightened. Because if we had to levy an additional $5 million from residents a year, like 1% levy is about 125,000, right? Isn't 175? Okay, so what are we looking at, 175 into 5 million? Like how much of a levy is that? Like 30, 40%? Like this is really frightening. So I'm sitting here thinking, if this is the case, that we are, like we're kind of in a critical situation here, that maybe we shouldn't be spending any money on anything until we get a better handle on this. Like, I mean, this, to my mind, this is a really important discussion to have in advance of the budget, because, I mean, we can't put that kind of tax increase on residents. So on the upside, in terms of us being borrowers, we're not big borrow. I can't even use that word, but we don't borrow a lot of money. Like from a municipality perspective, we have a lot less debt than other municipalities, so we're in a good situation that way. But is there some kind of like we really, if this is true, we really need to really think carefully and just do what's critical for budget 2025. And also look at maybe we need to incur a greater level of debt if there are some critical needs that we can't address without going into debt, because we're still very healthy on that side. So those are just my comments, observations.
Mr. Delmonico, do you want to respond, or do you want to wait till Member Scandinavia's question too?
Oh, no, if I could just say, I mean, bring this information here not to alarm you. I think this is just, we have to consider it as a roadmap. It's a long journey, right? I mean, our assets, although they're in the hundreds of millions, they're relatively in good condition, they're relatively new. And so they're not in need of replacement, many of them, in the immediate term. But I think that just means that now's the time to start thinking about this, to start saving a little bit each year, so that can continue to grow and compound on itself, rather than trying to delay it. And then at that point, you'd be left in a serious problem, maybe 10, 20 years down the road. But I think if we start thinking and saving a little bit now, we can make a lot of benefit for the future.
So we've already had a reserve strategy, but I guess it's been inadequate. If this is where we are today.
And really, that's what came out of the asset management study, knowing that we are short that every single year, as other municipalities are across the province. We are in, I hate to put it this way, but we are in good company with 443 other municipalities in exactly the same position, some in a much worse position, whose assets are in a much poorer state of affairs. And the reports coming from the region of Niagara about, as our regional councillor shared with us the other night, about the water and sewage treatment plants and how old they are and how much has to be put into them. So those examples are right around us as well. But Member Scandinavo, you have the floor. Oh, go right ahead.
I'd just like to suggest, we could capture it somehow, that we start looking more broadly at solutions other than just taxing residents. There may be properties that we can liquidate, or there may be consolidation of buildings. I think we need to really think quite broadly about how we could address this other than just the taxation route.
Member Scandinavo, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So I'm just pulling up the financial statements from our last meeting. The portion of property taxes that makes its way back to the town of Grimsby is like 21.7 million approximately, after paying the region. Total revenues, including like others, other user fees and so on and so forth, is 47.6 million. Last year, according to these, the reconciliation, there was about 8 million transferred out of the surplus into reserves. Are we saying up to another 11 million in addition? Is that, am I understanding that correctly? So like a total reserve transfer, again, using your worst case scenario and last year as an example, about 19 million in transfers to reserves to be healthy? Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, in the long term, right? That's what we want to keep in mind in the long term. And again, I want to caution you, so a lot of these are estimates because we don't have actual, appraised values of all our assets and replacement costs. So we're using the best data available. And from what we can tell, that would be, that's right. We're transferring about 8 million now. It would require about another 11 million long term to eventually be sustainable. But the good news is we have time to build up to that. And
Tony, I don't think this is, I'm sorry, I think it's alarming, but I don't think you bringing this here is an issue. I think this is exactly what we're here to discuss. So thank you for bringing that forward. But I guess it is kind of alarming is what I'm trying to say, is that like maybe we should like delve into a little more detail on this and like get a better sense of like, you know, what's the runway to get to 11 million? What's the value of the assets? And then I guess really consider acquiring new assets while you're trying to, you know, maintain the ones that we have. But I suppose we'll be getting more information on this, correct? Like this is just the start of a longer journey?
It is the start of a long journey. I mean, certainly the asset management plan really brought that home, right? They brought home the number of what we are short every single year. I believe that there was at one of our prior meetings, we had a summary, or we had, I'll call it a summary. We had a summary presented to us of what that impact was, and I think, or was that at council now? It might have taken place at council, but we still circulated that report, I thought, to the lay members on our finance committee. So that is still something to keep in mind. But yes, it is a very current topic. It is something that finance needs to have some ideas on to present and recommend to council on ways to how we're going to get through, how we get to this point. And that's why I always use the example of the two households, right? The one that saved and then had the money to spend when the time came, and the other one that always had to borrow in order to take on the project and then perpetually lived in debt. Got to the same end at the end of 10 years. They both did 5 projects, but the one was prepared and saved and didn't have to incur interest. The other one did, right? I think we'd all rather be the second example in my example, right? So I'm sure staff will be looking at some of the suggestions that Councillor Vardy had, but at the end of the day, you know, it really probably comes down to things that other municipalities are considering, like capital infrastructure levies and so on, that those are some of the hard choices we're going to have to make. If we want to keep things constant, we have to give up stuff. If we really want to save on top of it, potential tax levy increases coming, right? These are tough questions and tough answers to come to. But Councillor Kristanji, you have the floor.
Thank you, through Chair. I think this is very important to look at and start discussing, and I think it relates to the last discussion on the user fee study, and the more that we can offset costs as a total, then helps with these decisions as well. So I do think that they're linked, and I think anything that we can save and have costs cover themselves, that frees up a little bit more leeway for the saving for the infrastructure.
I guess at the end of the day, though, the reason for this report is really a policy report to say that, okay, this is the strategy that's being recommended, that we have specific reserves for specific capital replacements, and that we are going to be targeting to have annual contributions at a certain level, yet to be determined, but to be determined, and that's the plan as to how to fund and have the money to pay for the replacement of the current capital items that we own today. And then in addition to that, in our next agenda item is the capital, the larger capital ones, the one-offs, the unique ones, and so on. So basically, this report is about a policy mindset as to what we recommend and how we tackle these gaps and how we start building up the funds for them. Any further questions? Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, just one last comment. Yeah, I agree, Chair, that this is excellent because it's like it's a policy to be able to draw some structure at how you deal with these issues, right? So I think we got a little sidetracked when we heard the numbers, but that being said, it's good to have this policy. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Like, the policy's good, having the structure around it, it really is helpful with decision-making when things arise and we have an opportunity to do so. I just really hope we, put it in action and really start looking at, like, when you acquire an asset, it's not just the acquisition cost, it's the operating costs, and then the future costs of maintenance. Because once you put up a building, it doesn't, we all know, we all own houses, you don't just put it up once and forget about it. There's constant maintenance. So this is helpful. This is a helpful tool in that decision-making, so thank you.
I think one of the things that Mr. Delmonico and I have talked about and then that I know you're considering in the future, just as an aside, so our work plan that we had laid out as a committee with staff more than a year ago now, is coming to an end in December, and so staff are now working on laying out that work plan again for 2025. And one of the things we were talking about was tying in the policy with the amount of the reserves, with the amount of assets, and sort of laying out, so bringing all those components, those legs of the stool together, and then laying out some forecasting 5 and 10 years out, that, okay, this is what the expected expenditures are, this is how much is going into reserve, how much would be coming out to fund it, this is where the gaps are, and so on. It's a big project to kind of go through all the reserves and all the assets and lay out a strategy that way, but would kind of bring those tools of the stool together, right? So now we have a policy, and we have an asset management study, and we know what's in reserves, but now we need to bring them all together and lay out a roadmap long-term for, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, right? And 10 years, that crystal ball gets a little fuzzy 10 years out because it's so far out. But I see that sort of as the role of the committee working with our finance director to kind of lay out a strategy long-term as to how we do this. Comments? It's a big job. It's a big number. I take a little bit of a sense of a good sense that, like, we're in a pretty good position compared to some municipalities. So we're not in the bottom of 10% by any means. We're not in the top 10%, but we're okay. But we need to tackle it too, compared to our fellow municipalities. So, one last chance for questions or comments. Okay, then the resolution is resolved that report Finance 24-33 on reserves and reserve fund policy update dated October 24th, 2024 be received, and that the amended reserve and reserve fund policy attached as Appendix A be approved. All those in favor by show of hands, please. That is carried. The next report, and that is on our agenda, is number 8.4, and that has to do with our capital financing policy. And sorry, I got a bit ahead of myself, but Mr. Delmonico, just walk us through that briefly, even though you sort of have.
Sure. So this is actually a new policy. So because it's new, we thought it'd be best to bring it here for first review and comment this month, and then bring it back for approval next month. And the policy is intended to act as a framework for decision-making for capital budgeting purposes with the intent of enhancing fiscal sustainability and reducing risk. So, in practice, we're already following the framework outlined in this policy. It's not really anything new, but it does help to have this outlined in an approved policy to help provide that guidance as we move forward. So the policy objectives include making sure that we adhere to statutory requirements, making sure that we're ensuring the long-term financial sustainability of the town, limiting financial risk exposure, and minimizing the long-term cost of financing. So the principles of the policy are, as I mentioned earlier, that growth would pay for growth, asset rehabilitation and renewal would be funded by reserves, and debt would be limited to strategic investments. And by being selective with debt, it not only provides the town with flexibility to support those investments, but It also preserves debt room to deal with unplanned expenses or emergencies while avoiding costly interest charges. And if you look at Appendix B of the report, it provides a nice one-page visual representation of what the strategy looks like. So, we also do want to recognize that there may be times where infrastructure needs, to be put in place before growth, for example, and DC is collected, so debt may be appropriate to fund some DC projects. We also recognize that, a long-term asset management plan needs to be put in place, and until we work on that and get to that point where it's fully sustainable, debt may be needed in the interim to fund high-priority asset rehabilitation projects where the reserve funding isn't currently available. And so when it comes to debt, there is a provincial limit which has been set as the maximum. That's the maximum principal and interest payments that we make cannot exceed 25% of our own source revenues. And the province also provides a risk range as shown on page 3 of the report. It identifies that debt levels in excess of 10%, although permitted, are considered high risk. So what this policy suggests is that for internal purposes, we would have an internal debt limit of no more than 10% of our own source revenues. Currently, we're at 1.2%. That's expected to increase to 3.7 once the debt for the West Lincoln Memorial Hospital and the Peach King Center are factored in. And so if you look at Appendix A of the report, that is the capital financing policy. And again, it's here for first review and comment with the intent to bring it back next month for approval. So happy to take any questions or comments.
I'll give the floor to Member Thompson first, and then Member Scandinavo.
Yes, through you, Chair, to the Director. Thank you. All the reports, just love them. But I just wondering, does the town still have a 10-year rolling capital program in place that you can see everything?
Yeah, yes, we do. That's brought forward each year with the capital budget, along with the next year ask.
Okay, I was just wondering, maybe in right at 4A, that maybe that could be the opening, that the town shall maintain a 10-year rolling average. I'll send them in comments. I'll make life easier. And then I think lastly was, what else did I have marked down here? Oh yeah, again, not the expert in finance. It almost appears the mixture of reading other municipalities, debt management policy in there. Should this be a capital/debt management policy, or is there other debt management that, now stay out of that?
Yeah, we thought it'd be best to go with the capital financing, which is, it's not just debt, it's more broader. It incorporates, the philosophy around reserves and things like development charges.
Member Scandinavo.
Thanks again for this. This is like a very helpful graphics and very easy to follow. I just had a question, and it actually relates to something I said a little earlier. I like your comment here about, maintenance is done with reserves, growth-related projects are done with like additional charges. But the piece that I think really needs to be highlighted is that, again, when you add a significant asset, like what are the additional impacts? Yes, you might charge additional development charges or additional levies for that growth. But again, that's not where it stops. Like if it's a building, that building needs to be operated. If it's, again, consistent with that, not only does it need to be operated, it also needs to, now we have to add to that reserve fund because it's just another asset that's going to require maintenance, right? So I think it's important that when making a decision to expand, there's one thing about paying for it, but there's another thing about maintaining it and keeping it long-term. In my experience in these types of projects, everyone's hyper-focused on, how do we build it? But nobody ever talks about how do we operate it and how do we keep it? Like once you build a building or once you add a significant asset, it's there, right? And, how do we factor in that in the decision-making process, like in a policy to say, not only are we looking at this, but we're looking at like the long-term, because otherwise you wind up in situations where you have an asset that now you can't afford, right? Like think about like putting in a pool. You know, if you put in a pool at your house, it's great. Everybody thinks about that capital cost of like digging the hole and putting in the pool. Nobody thinks about, well, my gas bill is going to be higher because of the heater. Nobody thinks about my hydro bill is going to be higher because of the pump. Nobody thinks about the opening and closing costs, or, you know, I need a new liner in 5 years, or yada, yada, yada. So I think that, you know, it's not just about the asset, it's about the asset and the long-term maintenance and operating costs. So I think I'd like to see something along those lines in here if everyone's in agreement, but this has been very, very, very helpful to follow, and it's been a well-written report, so thanks, Tony.
I will concur with those comments too, that especially, it's one thing when we're just replacing, and I'll use, you know, water mains and sewer lines and so on. Typically in those situations, we start to have more breaks, more maintenance, and then we get to the point where, okay, we need to replace this, and we know what the replacement cost is, and we know that going forward, typically the repair and maintenance will be less because we have a brand new asset. It's like buying a new car. Typically, you know, there's not as much repairs in the first few years. But we know that when we get into new projects that we've never had before, new building projects especially, that you're right, it's not just the cost of it, but now it's the new costs associated with running it and keeping it up to standard and so on. This capital financing policy is before us tonight, really just for our consideration. It'll be coming back to the next meeting. And so on your point, I do think it's important, though, that it be noted somehow that when you know, the Finance Committee recommends that when new projects be considered to be undertaken, that the capital and ongoing operational costs be considered before they are approved by council. Or is that kind of summarizing what you're saying there?
Yeah, that's bang on. We should consider as part of the project, if it's net new, again, if it's replacing something that's existing, that's a different story because we've already had the asset, or if it's a major repair to something existing. If it's something net new, we shouldn't just consider the capital cost. We should consider the capital cost, the ongoing operating costs, and then the fact that now we're going to have to contribute to the reserves for future repairs. Like, these are, like, it's not just the purchase of the asset, right? We have to think beyond that. Because it will impact levies, it will impact costs to the community. So
I guess my question really is to Mr. Delmonico, is that how do we, or in which policy would it be good to build that concept in? I'm not so sure it really fits with the capital financing per se, but would that be something to consider to build into this policy, or do you think there's another policy that exists that it could fit in, or do we need a third new one?
Yeah, I'm thinking it might be good to build into this policy, and maybe as something like, you know, like you're saying with net new assets, when it comes forward in the budget, that as part, you know, when we have a description of what the project entails, we should try to estimate what's the operating impact of this new project, just so when it's being approved by council, they're fully aware of that.
Councillor Howe?
Thank you, Chair. Director, but we have done that, like we went through the AMPs, the core and the non-core. Okay, but we came up with I'm going to say methodology, probably with too complex a word, to determine that asset cost, or our investment down the road. Isn't that already in place with the asset management plan, that anything new is going to get numbered, you know, put numbers against it, or not?
There we go. So I'm trying to understand. So I think the asset management plan kind of outlined our estimated replacement costs in total. And I think what we want to do as a next step related to the reserve report is kind of try to break that down into what is that on an asset-by-asset basis, and where would those assets be funded from which reserve to kind of arrive at that gap? Is that what you're asking? Is that?
I guess I'm just trying to find the comfort zone for that work, because you got, an asset management plan, and we're talking about an asset management plan, but then we're talking about it being listed in the reserve or in the reserve fund. But I guess I'm just trying to keep it straight in my head. It all has to do with asset management planning.
Yeah, it was, as part of those reports, the financial part of that was ultimately deferred to future budgets by council, right? And so that's where we come back to that need for a capital levy, right? If we really want to cut down the gap, we're going to have to start looking at something like that in one shape or form.
I think what it really is we had an asset management study that told us these are the assets, these are the condition of the assets, this is the service life of the assets, and so on. Now what we have to work on is, as I said, the legs of the stool. We know how much money we have in the bank and investments and in our reserves. We know what the asset management study is telling us is coming at us. Now we have to connect it literally into a forecasted, call it a study, a forecast or whatever, as to how we bring these components together to actually fund and prepare to have the money there for when the assets need to be replaced, right? So that's kind of the longer-term project that is facing our finance director, is to bring all those components together for us. But this part that we were talking about the capital projects and looking at not just the cost, but the ongoing maintenance and replacement and so on, is just an idea that perhaps you could consider, because this policy is just here before us tonight for consideration and comment, and it'll be coming to us at the next meeting for our final comments. So just food for thought at this point in time. Any other thoughts, feedback on this policy at this time? And do I have a first and seconder for you?
I can't remember.
Can't. Let me step back and ask someone to move and to second. And I saw two hands here, Member Thompson and Councillor Howe, moving and seconding it, and resolve that report, Finance 24-34, Capital Financing Policy dated October 24th, 2024 be received, and that the draft Capital Financing Policy, which is included as Appendix A to this report, be received for first review and comment. All those in favor with a show of hands, please. That is carried. That is my fault. Getting really keen and right into the topic and then forget to put it on the floor. My apologies. Moving on now to agenda item 8.5, and that is the Peach King Center report. So let me get this right. So the report now, if I could have a mover and seconder to get it on the floor, please. Councillor Kersanji and Councillor Vardy. So the report is before you this evening. Mr. Delmonico, would you like to just walk us through the high points on it?
Thank you. So we are still trending to have the project come in on budget. Construction tendering is now complete, and you'll see the variances for those tender packages outlined in Table 2. You'll also see the design-related change orders that have been approved of $796,000. And even with those change orders, we've been able to come in on budget for the construction costs. The remaining change orders approved are shown in the miscellaneous and contingency line. So you'll see that $172,846 in change orders. In addition to those design ones, they've been approved to date. Given that the contingency is hard to forecast, it's there to cover unplanned expenses. For the purposes of this report, we're still forecasting to use the full contingency. And that's why you'll see the overall variance is just about zero. But to date, we have only needed to dip into the contingency for a relatively low amount, so I think that's a good sign, given where we're at right now in the project. So we'll continue to provide these monthly updates, and just if there's any questions or comments at this time.
Questions or comments? Member Scandinavo.
Sorry, I'm doing a lot of talking tonight, but again, this report is super helpful. It's really easy to follow. It's just a great update. I think we're being uber conservative, which is helpful, like to express that we're using, basically the full contingency when we've only drawn 172,000. I just wanted to congratulate staff for this big project, and, seems like everything's on board, and thanks again for this really clear report, Tony.
Any other comments or questions? It's good when there's none. No, I'm just joking. You're allowed to question and comment for sure. But it just means, yes, everyone is happy with the report and happy with the results that we're seeing. So resolve that report, Finance 24-35, the Peach King Center expansion, October 2024, update be received for information. All those in favor by show of hands, please. And that is carried. Next up on our agenda is item 8.6, Finance Report 24-36, which has to do with a vehicle replacement in the building department. Could I have a mover and seconder to get it on the floor? That's Member Thompson and Councillor Howe. And Mr. Delmonico, if you could walk us through it, please.
Yes, thank you. So the building department's vehicle has been having issues, and they brought it in for servicing, and it was actually deemed to be no longer safe to drive, and it was taken out of service. So they're currently using alternate vehicles such as bylaw on a temporary basis. Now this vehicle is actually scheduled for replacement in the 2025 capital budget. It was going to be submitted as a request, so it ended up conking out on us a few months early. So they're asking for $50,000 now to go ahead and procure a new vehicle, and they will be looking for environmentally friendly options, since this is kind of a light-duty vehicle that should be something that's worth looking into.
Any questions on this report? Member Thompson.
My turn to talk again. Yes, thank you, Chair. Through you, Chair, to the Director. I just didn't see anything in there about following the procurement procedures. This is going to another town department or going to be surplus and off the auction?
Yeah, I think it's going to be auctioned off, and we'll try to get whatever we can for it.
And I hope, just finally, being around again, maybe we can talk to Public Works and see what it takes the mechanics in the future, possibly to maintain an electric vehicle. They may not have the capabilities. So if they don't have the capabilities, we shouldn't be even looking at this or moving forward with it unless we're prepared. Council's prepared to send these vehicles out to a mechanic that's qualified to do that. So that'd be nice to know in the future.
I think it's important to be clear on the differences, that there's gas, hybrid, then there are what they call PHEVs, which are plug-in hybrid electric, and then there are truly electric. So there's really 4 types here. And the recommendation from Finance a number of months ago was to ask our staff to at least look at moving from gas to hybrid, which really still use gas. And so I think that's one of the things that they will be considering, or at least that's what this report says, that they will be considering and looking at. But I do agree with you, like moving totally to electric vehicles, one requires an infrastructure to be close by so that you can charge them all the time. And I personally have some concerns about that too. And then having charging stations within the town's facilities as well for even our own vehicles, let alone the uniqueness of the skill set that is then needed to service those vehicles too. So, of the 4 options, that's kind of option 4. We're at option 1 saying, can you consider moving towards option 2, which are hybrids, which still use gas. But which are better at using the regenerating power of the brakes to help with replenish the battery. So anyway, we're not moving all the way to 4 at this point in time. Any other questions or comments about this report? Then the resolution is resolved that report Finance 24-36, the Building Department Vehicle Replacement dated October 24th, 2024, be received, and that the Finance Standing Committee approve the purchase of a Building Department vehicle with a budget amendment of $50,000, and that the budget amendment of $50,000 be funded from the Building Department Reserve Fund. All those in favor, please, with a show of hands, and that is carried. Item 9 on our agenda is correspondence, of which we have none. Under item number 10, other business, is the last-minute amendment to our agenda tonight. So if I could have a mover and a seconder to accept the resignation of Member Hutchings, please. Councillor Vardy and Councillor Cristangi. Resolved that the Finance Committee regretfully accepts the resignation of Member Hutchings. All those in favor? I wish there was really a choice about this. Obviously, the member controls it. I would say that is passed. I hear you. It would be nice to put up our hand and say, no, we don't accept it, but unfortunately, we don't have that much control. So that is passed. And then item 11, our next finance meeting is scheduled for November 28th, 2024. Did we have some other new business? At 6 p.m. One of the things that our clerk's department nicely did for council members was they did put together a meeting calendar for 2025 and printed it in color, which is enormously helpful because all the different committees are highlighted on there. And the clerk's department will be sending it out to our lay members as well, so that you'll have a schedule right for the next 12 months that shows the... It was?
Back in early September, yeah, it was sent out.
Okay, so just a reminder then to check your email to find it. If you'd like one printed in color to make it easier, if you want hard copy in color, do let our clerk's department know. But if you're planning vacation or any of those things, you have a calendar in front of you now for all of 2025. Member Thompson, yes.
Yes, sorry, Chair. This is through you, but I think it's to anybody that's going to watch this later, hear it, and I hope all residents of Niagara speak up to what we heard the other night at Regional Council from the Regional Councillor. I would just want to thank Councillor Vardy for her comments and trying to protect the taxpayers in this area, because it's going to be effect on us, and especially here at Finance again, that now I just don't understand when they had a 2016 water and wastewater plan that identifies at 2041, their infrastructure solid, pretty good. And they've been following that. It's on their website. And for them to come out and say this, and after we experienced Walkerton and after we've done their most critical infrastructure, I don't know how disappointed as a taxpayer it can be. This is so disappointing, and I'm just hoping other taxpayers will speak up. And sorry for all of you that we all have to bear this now come our budget. And it's not going to be easy. But thank you for Councillor Vardy speaking up on that. I think I'm totally shocked to hear the CAO say they're at crisis stage, but their 2016 plan that they're supposed to be following, I just don't understand it. And I'm very disappointed, but thank you.
Any other matters of new business that any member would like to raise tonight? Then if there are none, we will call this meeting adjourned. Thank you.